Section 2 of The Brain and the Voice in Speech and Song by F. W. Mott. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The vocal instrument. A distinction is generally made in physics between sound and noise. Noise affects our tympanic membrane as an irregular succession of shocks, and we are conscious of a jarring of the auditory apparatus, whereas a musical sound is smooth and pleasant because the tympanic membrane is thrown into successive periodic vibrations to which the auditory receptor, sense organ of hearing, has been attuned. To produce musical sounds, a body must vibrate with the regularity of a pendulum, but it must be capable of imparting sharper or quicker shocks to the air than the pendulum. All musical sounds, however they are produced and by whatever means they are propagated, may be distinguished by three different qualities: 1. Loudness, 2. Pitch, 3. Quality, timbre or clang, as the Germans call it. Loudness depends upon the amount of energy expended in producing the sound. If I rub a tuning fork with a well-rosined bow, I set it in vibration by the resistance offered to the rosined hair, and if while it is vibrating, I again apply the bow, thus expending more energy, the note produced is louder. Repeating the action several times, the width of excursion of the prongs of the tuning fork is increased. This I can demonstrate not merely by the loudness of the sound which can be heard, but by sight, for if a small mirror be fixed on one of the prongs and a beam of light be cast upon the mirror, the light being again reflected onto the screen, you will see the spot of light dance up and down, and the more energetically the tuning fork is bowed, the greater is the amplitude of the oscillation of the spot of light. The duration of the time occupied is the same in traversing a longer as in traversing a shorter space, as is the case of the swinging pendulum. The vibrating prongs of the tuning fork throw the air into vibrations which are conveyed to the ear and produce the sensation of sound. The duration of time occupied in the vibrations of the tuning fork is therefore independent of the space passed over. The greater or less energy expended does not influence the duration of time occupied by the vibration. It only influences the amplitude of the vibration. The second quality of musical sounds is the pitch, and the pitch depends upon the number of vibrations that a sounding body makes in each second of time. The most unmusical ear can distinguish a high note from a low one, even when the interval is not great. Low notes are characterized by a relatively small number of vibrations, and as the pitch rises, so the number of vibrations increase. This can be proved in many ways. Take, for example, two tuning forks of different size. The shorter produces a considerably higher pitched note than the longer one. If a mirror be attached to one of the prongs of each fork, and a beam of light be cast upon each mirror successively, and then reflected in a revolving mirror, the oscillating spot of light is converted into a series of waves, and if the waves obtained by reflecting the light from the mirror of the smaller one be counted, and compared with those reflected from the mirror attached to the larger fork, it will be found that the number of waves reflected from the smaller fork is proportionately to the difference in pitch more numerous than the waves reflected from the larger. The air is thrown into corresponding periodic vibrations according to the rate of vibration of the sound-producing body. Thirdly, the quality, timbre, or clang depends upon the overtones, in respect to which I could cite many experiments to prove that whenever a body vibrates, other bodies near it may be set in vibration, but only on condition that such bodies shall be capable themselves of producing the same note. A number of different forms of resonators can be used to illustrate this law, a law indeed which is of the greatest importance in connection with the mechanism of the human voice. Although notes are of the same loudness and pitch when played on different instruments or spoken or sung by different individuals, yet even a person with no ear for music can easily detect a difference in the quality of the sound and is able to recognize the nature of the instrument or the timbre of the voice. This difference in the timbre is due to harmonics or overtones. Could we but see the sonorous waves in the air during the transmission of the sound of a voice, we should see stamped on it the conditions of motion upon which its characteristic qualities depended, which is due to the fact that every vocal sound whose vibrations have a complex form can be decomposed into a series of simple notes all belonging to the harmonic series. These harmonics or overtones will be considered later when dealing with the timbre or quality of the human voice. The vocal instrument is unlike any other musical instrument. It most nearly approaches a reed instrument. The clarinet and the oboe are examples of reed instruments, in which the reed does not alter, but by means of stops, the length of the column of air in the resonating pipe varies, and determines the pitch of the fundamental note. The organ pipe with the vibrating tongue of metal serving as the reed is perhaps the nearest approach to the vocal organ, but here again it is the length of the pipe which determines the pitch of the note. The vocal instrument may be said to consist of three parts: 1. The bellows, 2. The membranous reed contained in the larynx, which by the actions of groups of muscles can be altered in tension, and thus variation in pitch determined, 3. The resonator, which consists of the mouth, the throat, the larynx, the nose, and air sinuses contained in the bones of the skull, also the windpipe, the bronchial tubes, and the lungs. The main and important part of the resonator, however, is situated above the glottis, the opening between the vocal cords, and is capable of only slight variations in length and of many and important variations in form. In the production of musical sounds its chief influence is upon the quality of the overtones, and therefore upon the timbre of the voice. Moreover, the movable structures of the resonator, the lower jaw, the lips, the tongue, the soft palate, can, by changing the form of the resonator, not only impress upon the sound waves particular overtones as they issue from the mouth, but simultaneously can effect the combination of vowels and consonants with the formation of syllables, the combination of syllables with the formation of words, and the combination of words with the formation of articulate language. The reed portion of the instrument, acting alone, can only express emotional feeling. The resonator, the effector of articulate speech, is the instrument of intelligence, will, and feeling. It must not, however, be thought that the vocal instrument consists of two separately usable parts, for phonation, except in the whispered voice, always accompanies articulation. In speech, and more especially in singing, there is an art of breathing. Ordinary inspiration and expiration necessary for the oxygenation of the blood is performed automatically and unconsciously. But in singing, the respiratory apparatus is used like the bellows of a musical instrument, and it is controlled and directed by the will. The art of breathing properly is fundamental for the proper production of the singing voice and the speaking voice of the orator. It is necessary always to maintain in the lungs, which act as the bellows, a sufficient reserve of air to finish a phrase. Therefore, when the opportunity arises, it is desirable to take in as much air as possible through the nostrils, and without any apparent effort. The expenditure of the air in the lungs must be controlled and regulated by the power of the will in such a way as to produce efficiency in loudness with economy of expenditure. It must be remembered, moreover, that mere loudness of sound does not necessarily imply carrying power of the voice, either when speaking or singing. Carrying power, as we shall see later, depends as much upon the proper use of the resonator as upon the force of expulsion of the air by the bellows. Again, a soft note, especially an aspirate, owing to the vocal chink being widely opened, may be the cause of an expenditure of a larger amount of air than a loud-sounding note. Observations upon anencephalous monsters, infants born without the great brain, show that breathing and crying can occur without the cerebral hemispheres. Moreover, Goltz's dog, in which all the brain had been removed except the stem and base, was able to bark, growl, and snarl, indicating that the primitive function of the vocal instrument can be performed by the lower centers of the brain situated in the medulla oblongata. But the animal growled and barked when the attendant who fed it daily approached to give it food, which was a clear indication that the bark and growl had lost both its affective and cognitive significance. It was, indeed, a purely automatic reflex action. It was dependent upon a stimulus arousing an excitation in an instinctive automatic nervous mechanism in the medulla oblongata and spinal cord, presiding over synergic groups of muscles habitually brought into action for this simplest form of vocalization, connected with the primitive emotion of anger. I will now consider at greater length each part of the vocal instrument. 1. The bellows. Figure 1. Front view of the thorax showing the breastbone, to which on either side are attached the rib cartilages. The remainder of the thoracic cage is formed by the ribs attached behind to the spine, which is only seen below. The lungs are represented filling the chest cavity, except a little to the left of the breastbone, below where the pericardium is shown. It can be seen that the ribs slope forwards and downwards, and that they increase in length from above downwards, so that if elevated by the muscles attached to them, they will tend to push forward the elastic cartilages and breastbone, and so increase the antero-posterior diameter of the chest. Moreover, the ribs, being elastic, will tend to give a little at the angle, and so the lateral diameter of the chest will be increased. End of caption. The bellows consist of the lungs enclosed in the movable thorax. The latter may be likened to a cage. It is formed by the spine behind and the ribs, which are attached by cartilages to the breastbone, sternum, in front. The ribs and cartilages, as the diagram shows, form a series of hoops which increase in length from above downwards. Moreover, they slope obliquely downwards and inwards. The ribs are jointed behind to the vertebra in such a way that muscles attached to them can, by shortening, elevate them. The effect is that the longer ribs are raised, and pushing forward the breastbone and cartilages, the thoracic cage enlarges from before back, but being elastic, the hoops will give a little and cause some expansion from side to side. Moreover, when the ribs are raised, each one is rotated on its axis in such a way that the lower border tends toward eversion. The total effect of this rotation is a lateral expansion of the whole thorax. Between the ribs and the cartilages, the space is filled by the intercostal muscles, the action of which, in conjunction with other muscles, is to elevate the ribs. It is, however, unnecessary to enter into anatomical details and describe all those muscles which elevate and rotate the ribs, and thereby cause enlargement of the thorax in its antero-posterior and lateral diameters. There is, however, one muscle which forms the floor of the thoracic cage called the diaphragm that requires more than a passing notice, inasmuch as it is the most effective agent in the expansion of the chest. It consists of a central tendinous portion, above which lies the heart, contained in its bag or pericardium, on either side attached to the central tendon on the one hand and to the spine behind, to the last rib laterally, and to the cartilages of the lowest 6 ribs anteriorly, is a sheet of muscle fibers which form on either side of the chest a dome-like partition between the lungs and the abdominal cavity. The phrenic nerve arises from the spinal cord in the upper cervical region and descends through the neck and chest to the diaphragm. It is therefore a special nerve of respiration. There are 2, one on each side supplying the 2 sheets of muscle fibers. When innervation currents flow down these nerves, the 2 muscular halves of the diaphragm contract, and the floor of the chest on either side descends. Thus the vertical diameter increases. Now the elastic lungs are covered with a smooth pleura which is reflected from them onto the inner side of the wall of the thorax, leaving no space between. Consequently, when the chest expands in all 3 directions, the elastic lungs expand correspondingly. But when, either voluntarily or automatically, the nerve currents that cause contraction of the muscles of expansion cease, the elastic structures of the lungs and the thorax, including the muscles, recoil, the diaphragm ascends, and the ribs, by the force of gravity, tend to fall into the position of rest. During expansion of the chest, a negative pressure is established in the air passages and air flows into them from without. In contraction of the chest, there is a positive pressure in the air passages and air is expelled. In normal, quiet breathing, an ebb and flow of air takes place rhythmically and subconsciously. Thus, in the ordinary speaking of conversation, we do not require to exercise any voluntary effort in controlling the breathing. But the orator, and more especially the singer, uses his knowledge and experience in the voluntary control of his breath, and he is thus enabled to use his vocal instrument in the most effective manner. Figure 2, diagram modified from Quain's Anatomy to show the attachment of the diaphragm by fleshing pillars to the spinal column, to the rib cartilages, and lower end of the breastbone and last rib. The muscular fibers, intercostals, and elevators of the ribs are seen, and it will be observed that their action would be to rotate and elevate the ribs. The dome-like shape of the diaphragm is seen, and it can be easily understood that if the central tendon is fixed and the sheet of muscle fibers on either side contracts, the floor of the chest on either side will flatten, allowing the lungs to expand vertically. The joints of the ribs with the spine can be seen, and the slope of the surface of the ribs is shown, so that when elevation and rotation occur, the chest will be increased in diameter laterally. End of caption. A glance at the diagram shows the changes in the shape of the thorax in normal subconscious automatic breathing, and the changes in the voluntary conscious breathing of vocalization. It will be observed that there are marked differences. When voluntary control is exercised, the expansion of the chest is greater in all directions. Moreover, by voluntary conscious effort, the contraction of the chest is much greater in all directions. The result is that a larger amount of air can be taken into the bellows and a larger amount expelled. The mind can therefore bring into play at will more muscular forces, and so control and regulate these forces as to produce infinite variations in the pressure of the air in the soundpipe of the vocal instrument. But the forces which tend to contract the chest and drive the air out of the lungs would be ineffective if there were not simultaneously the power of closing the soundpipe. This, we shall see, is accomplished by the synergic action of the muscles which make tense and approximate the vocal cords. Although the elastic recoil of the lungs and the structure of the expanded thorax is the main force employed in normal breathing, and to some extent in vocalization, for it keeps up a constant, steady pressure, the mind, by exercising control over the continuance of elevation of the ribs and contraction of the abdominal muscles, regulates the force of the expiratory blast of air so as to employ the bellows most efficiently in vocalization. Not only does the contraction of the abdominal muscles permit of control over the expulsion of the air, but by fixing the cartilages of the lowest 6 ribs, it prevents the diaphragm drawing them upwards and inwards. The greatest expansion is just above the waistband. We are not conscious of the contraction of the diaphragm. We are conscious of the position of the walls of the chest and abdomen, the messages the mind receives relating to the amount of air in the bellows at our disposal come from sensations derived from the structures forming the wall of the chest and abdomen, viz. The position of the ribs. Their degree of elevation and forward protrusion combined with the feeling that the ribs are falling back into the position of rest. Besides, there is the feeling that the abdominal muscles can contract no more, a feeling which should never be allowed to arise before we become conscious of the necessity of replenishing the supply of air. This should be effected by quickly drawing in air through the nostrils without apparent effort and to as full extent as opportunity offers between the phrases. By intelligence and perseverance, the guiding sense which informs the singer of the amount of air at his disposal, and when and how it should be replenished and voluntarily used, is the fundamental importance to good vocalization. Collarbone breathing is deprecated by some authorities, but I see no reason why the apices of the lungs should not be expanded, and seeing the frequency with which tuberculosis occurs in this region, it might, by improving the circulation and nutrition, be even beneficial. The proper mode of breathing comes almost naturally to some individuals. To others, it requires patient cultivation under a teacher who understands the art of singing and the importance of the correct methods of breathing. The more powerfully the abdominal muscles contract, the laxer must become the diaphragm muscle. And by the law of the reciprocal innervation of antagonistic muscles, it is probable that with the augmented innervation currents to the expiratory center of the medulla, there is a corresponding inhibition of the innervation currents to the inspiratory center. These centers in the medulla preside over the centers in the spinal cord, which are in direct relation to the inspiratory and expiratory muscles. It is, however, probable that there is a direct relation between the brain and the spinal nerve centers, which control the costal and abdominal muscles independently of the respiratory centers of the medulla oblongata. The best method of breathing is that which is most natural. There should not be a protruded abdomen on the one hand, nor an unduly inflated chest on the other hand. The maximum expansion should involve the lower part of the chest and the uppermost part of the abdomen on a level of an inch or more below the tip of the breastbone. The expansion of the ribs should be maintained as long as possible. In short phrases, the movement may be limited to an ascent of the diaphragm, over which we have not the same control as we have of the elevation of the ribs, but it is better to reserve the costal air, over which we have more voluntary control, for maintaining a continuous pressure and for varying the pressure. End of section 2.